My name is Peter Sandø. I'm trained as a philosopher, and for a number of years I've been professor of bioethics at the University of Copenhagen. Here I teach courses for various students in philosophy of science, and I also engage in various research projects. This video is an attempt to combine these two activities. In our various philosophy of science courses, we try to teach the students how different scientific disciplines interact. And currently I'm part of a research project where we have different scientific disciplines who try to collaborate to solve a huge societal problem. In the project, which is called Governing Obesity, a number of colleagues from University of Copenhagen collaborate to try to help ways to prevent people from becoming obese and to help people who have become obese to solve their problems. The idea of this video is to show how different scientific disciplines can collaborate. The background is very sad and troublesome. Large parts of the world have, over the last decades, witnessed a huge increase in the number of people who become overweight and obese. The World Health Organizations even choose to talk about an obesity epidemic. According to the World Health Organization, overweight and obesity is defined as extreme or excessive amounts of fat deposits. And the way to measure it is typically by combining weight and height in the so-called body mass index. In the United States, obesity has even been defined as a disease. In the worst affected countries, like the United States or Mexico, about a third of the population is obese. In Denmark, Germany, and many other European countries, there's about 1 out of 6 who are obese. And today, more than 60% of the world's population lives in countries where more people are killed by obesity than they are by hunger and other forms of undernutrition. So obesity is therefore a very serious health problem that kills a lot of people and leads to decreased quality of life for many more people. On top of that, some will argue it also costs society a lot in terms of extra health costs, lost productivity and other things. So there are many good reasons to try to deal with this problem. So what can researchers do to help with the problem of obesity? This is what I, together with my 4 good colleagues, Hanne Andersen, Maja Horst, Peter Berger Nielsen and Morten Nielsen, have asked 6 prominent researchers from the project Governing Obesity. These colleagues cover a range of disciplines, going from physiology over human nutrition to sociology of food. And they will each start by describing their specific disciplinary take on the subject. And after that, they will try to tell us how they think they, by their means of their science, can help solving the problems relating to obesity.
My name is Anders Sjödin. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Copenhagen. I have a background as a medical doctor, and my main interest now is appetite regulation and regulation of body weight. So in nutrition, we use a lot of different methods, but the traditional and the most important is the intervention studies, where we can feed people a certain diet and then we compare with the same or another group of people that are being fed another diet, and we can compare the two groups to really see the difference and the effect of a certain diet or a nutrient or whatever. Well, the main reason for the obesity epidemic, as we see, is of course the $1 million question. Some people claim and have a huge interest in simple components and simple nutrients. I think it's rather the abundance of energy-dense foods around us that's the main problem. Our research hopefully contributes to the big puzzle. We've done studies on different carbohydrates, different fats, etc. And they do make difference, but unfortunately not really going to cure the obesity epidemic. There's a lot of discussion on what is needed of evidence before we recommend things. And I think it's a rather tricky question because, of course, we cannot just wait until we have the final proof. But of course, we shouldn't tell people to do things that we really don't know will benefit them. I think at times we may know differently a few years from now, but we have to act now, of course. So it's a practical question. In classical human nutrition, we have a lot of limitations, and I quite often wish I was in the rat field instead. Of course, we deal with humans, they live freely, they don't do exactly as we tell them to do, etc. So the intervention that we think we're doing may be very different from the real intervention out there. So we always have these huge problem with control and compliance, etc. Of course, our research quite often end up in a nutrition advice, but we know that giving advice is far from changing behaviors. We also very aware that there is so many other factors out in the society that may have a much bigger impact. If you pass by an ice cream stand, that is very tempting, and that's going to overrule any appetite regulation hormone in the body. I think obesity is a typical example of multifactorial causes, and that, for obvious reasons, then calls for huge collaboration with different disciplines and different knowledge, because there are so many factors contributing to the problem.
Yeah, my name is Bente Stalknecht, and I'm a professor of physical activity and obesity at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm a medical doctor, and my main area of research is physical activity and obesity. In my research, I study obesity by exercise interventions of especially moderately overweight subjects, in which we measure various metabolic health parameters before and after the interventions. According to our research, a main causal factor of the increasing prevalence of obesity is a decrease of physical activity level in all domains of everyday life, meaning both transport, leisure time, and also during working hours. Many people start exercising because they want to lose weight, and then they get discouraged because they do not lose weight while they're exercising. But according to my research, physical activity, also without weight loss, is very beneficial to metabolic health. Also, we investigated which dose of exercise is needed to give these metabolic health benefits. And we found that 30 minutes of daily exercise is nearly as beneficial as 60 minutes of daily exercise. In medical research, the gold standard is double-blinded randomized clinical trials. Then you perform meta-analysis of these randomized clinical trials to get the best evidence. However, with exercise interventions, of course, it's not possible to blind people to if they perform exercise or not. The limitations of my approach to studying obesity is that I only study the biomedical measures. I do exercise research, and I can study the effect of the interventions on the health parameters, but how to motivate people to exercise and how to motivate people to keep exercising, that I cannot study by biomedical measures. I see a great need for interdisciplinary collaborations. Biomedical researchers, we can only see a limited part of the whole picture. And for example, with exercise physiology, and to have people exercise more, we need other disciplines as well. For example, in the city, to have people active commuting, we need city planners and architects to motivate people to be physically active.
My name is Torben Hansen. I'm professor at University of Copenhagen in metabolic genetics. I'm trained as a medical doctor, and throughout my research life I have focused on genetics of obesity and diabetes. The common forms of obesity are partly explained by genetics. We know that from twin and family studies. And we study this by going into the population and look at genetic variation, explaining the variation in overweight and obesity. According to this research area, we know that genetics is very important, but genetics cannot explain the explosion we have had in overweight and obesity. So the main cause must be changes in environment. Our research might explain ways to attack or treat obesity at the individual level, because it's clear that each individual has a specific genetic makeup which make a susceptibility different from person to person. When it comes to childhood obesity, we profile the genetics of the children so that we can identify those who are at highest risk of developing obesity later in life, so that we can target our preventive strategies. When we define new genes associating to obesity or overweight, we are using statistical evidence. So a common variant in the population should associate with BMI or obesity at a very high statistical level. We are focusing on personalized medicine in two areas: the common forms of obesity and the monogenic forms of obesity. For the common forms of obesity, we try to make genetic profiles predicting obesity. We can then do targeted intervention or common forms of profiles which might determine response to specific interventions. With specific forms of obesity, we know the mutations, we know where the mutations they act. Often it's centrally in the brain, so we can look for drugs which directly target these areas in the brain in order to decrease the appetites of the individuals who have these mutations. The limitations in genetic studies, they are often ethical. So when we go and look into the genomes of human beings, we get a lot of information, not only on obesity, but also on a lot of other diseases. So we need to define the ethical questions before we start doing these kinds of research. Common forms of genetics is a complex, what we call trait. More than half of the variation in obesity is explained by genetics. The other part is explained by environmental factors. So far, when we look at the part which is genetic, we can only explain around 10% of the variation in BMI. So there's a lot to identify still in the genetic explanation for obesity. And then, of course, on top of that, we need to go to lifestyle and environmental factors and how they interact with genetic factors.
My name is Jens Holst. I'm a doctor. I'm a medical doctor. I am currently professor of medical physiology at the University of Copenhagen. The main method we're using is to study obese individuals and measure hormones regulating their appetite and food intake and metabolism to try to understand if something goes wrong in that direction. So the way we study obesity is by looking at people who are obese and serving them a meal and looking at their hormone levels to try to understand if anything is wrong with their hormonal regulation of appetite and food intake. What we have found so far is that there are definite disturbances in the hormonal pattern after meal intake in obese individuals. And it also seems that some of these disturbances may play a role in the development of obesity. So the problem of slimming which is, of course, extremely difficult for most people, is also something that has a foundation in endocrine, hormonal disturbances, and we're very interested in this subject. But let me emphasize that the most important aspect of the work we do is that if we understand these hormones and their role in metabolism, we can actually do something about obesity. We can treat obesity, we think. So I start looking at the obese individual and saying, here we have a person with a problem, he's obese. Can we do something about that? It's not really our business to understand completely why they've become obese, but we can do something about it. That's the main thing. We're definitely already on our way to understand new principles for the treatment of obesity. Perhaps the greatest thing that has happened in this field is a surgical operation, namely that of gastric bypass surgery. So the idea here is that we should be able to design a medical therapy, a non-surgical medical therapy, that can do the same as the surgery, but without surgery. So that's the main motive for our research these days. We think that a very effective therapy for obesity would be to use hormones from the gut, hormones that normally regulate appetite and food intake, to treat obesity. The question of why people remain at an elevated body weight, unchanged for a long time in many cases, is really a complicated one. It's very difficult. That is because we know that there are hormones both inhibiting the appetite, and there are also hormones that will allow appetite to remain high, because the body thinks, apparently, that once it has reached a certain level of body weight, this weight should be maintained. That's how we work. That's how our organism works. And the body will then defend by all thinkable means this body weight. And whenever you think of slimming, some of these hormonal mechanisms are increased or aggravated, and they fight fiercely to avoid a weight loss. And that's why this fight against an overweight, where you try to diet and lose weight, is almost lost already before you begin, because you have these very powerful mechanisms that fight against a weight loss. When are we satisfied? Clearly, any observation that we do is most often based on experiments where we've manipulated something to see what happens. And if we've seen that a number of times, then we say, okay, this is true, this is a reproducible event. And then we will try to translate that into, for instance, the therapy of type 2 diabetes, or obesity in this case. And for that, we're in big pharmaceutical industry regulations also, because there's a requirement that very large numbers of individuals are being treated with a certain degree of success before the authorities will accept any new pharmaceutical agents. So this is a very strict regulation, and the level of evidence is very, very high. We don't think that the hormonal theory here that I'm talking about is the full story, and I'd rather like to avoid the question of whether I think our hormones are essential for the development of obesity. The development of obesity is no doubt very complex, and I used to teach my students that the hedonic qualities of food intake are dominating. They're dominating above everything else, also our hormones. So even if the hormones protest, if you see a wonderful cake, you'll go for it, no matter what the hormones say. So that's the kind of picture we have of this. But it doesn't prevent us from being able to do something about it, because if this feeling of reward, or whatever you would call it, about having a very nice meal is powerful, then we can turn up the level of our hormones, and they are also very powerful. So eventually we can, perhaps, or hopefully we can combat the lust of having a good meal. So do we think that a single approach to understanding obesity can explain everything, or do we think that a collaborative approach is fruitful? Yes, we definitely do. Particularly to understand obesity, why it develops, I think it's absolutely necessary to take into consideration a large number of factors: political, societal, individual, psychological. In fact, as I said in the beginning, I don't think that our hormones play a primary role here. But we know that we have these systems that normally regulate appetite and food intake. So what we do is to try to understand them and to use this as information to plan interventions against obesity.
I am Torkild Sørensen, and I am professor of clinical and metabolic epidemiology at the University of Copenhagen, and I have worked in that area for about 25 years, being interested mainly in obesity, which actually started almost 40 years ago. And I still find it very fascinating. I'm a medical doctor by training, but I haven't treated obese patients as such. We study obesity in many different ways. One of the main ways to do it is to look into the people in the societies, and we are very fortunate to get information from various measurements done on the people. For example, in schools where many kids have been measured, their height and weight, and we have then computerized all this stuff, and then we can work on it and see what is happening to all these kids in the long term and what came before they become obese and so forth. The main reason why we see this increase in obesity is really a mystery. Most people think that this is due to simple things such as eating too much and moving too less. But when we get closer to the question, it's very clear that this is not a sufficient explanation. The main ideas we have so far is that there is a very tight relationship between your life circumstances, what is going on in your psyche, in your mental states, and how the brain reacts to that, and how the brain reacts to the regulation of your body weight, how much fat should be put into the fat tissue so you get more or less obese. Fat is a store of energy as a reserve for the future. And therefore, it's very logical to think that the body has some way of identifying the potential future lack. So the theory is that this mechanism, this way of realizing that there might be a lack, is what is going wrong behind obesity, and it's becoming worse and worse. The current idea is that there might be something that is going on even before the people are conceived, and it could be something about the living conditions of the parents. So we may be forced to look in the very early life, even before people are formed, so to say. Obviously, people can slim, and it seems to be a good thing. It seems to be good because they like their body better, they have a better blood pressure and blood sugar, but there is a problem, namely that they seem to live shorter lives if they slim, and we don't understand why this is. In order to have good evidence, we really need to do very big studies where people have tried different ways of coping with the problem, and to see who are actually in very, very many ways of life doing better than those who do it differently. So the big trials, they're called trials, are very important. The limitations we have in our research is mainly that we are not able really to measure in a very good way how obese people are. We have body height and weight. It seems to be much more important for their health problems if the fat is in the belly rather than, for example, around the hips or on the thighs. Another very important limitation is that everything that goes on with obesity is over long time periods. And so we have to be very patient, and we have to repeat all these measurements, hopefully, if we can do it, multiple times, so we can see what is going on in the long term. It's very clear that it would be very good with more interdisciplinary research in our field. I see clearly the need to have a variety of social sciences, even philosophy and sociology and history, not least, because the obesity epidemic is a historical phenomenon. So we need historians to help us to really understand what has developed over time. This is history. And of course, this is a professional area of research where a lot of techniques and methods and concepts have been developed that we can take advantage of.
My name is Lotte Holm. I'm a sociologist, and I work with people's relationship to food in various arenas, in everyday life and in institutions. Obesity is not only a physiological matter, it also depends on what people do in their daily lives, the way they understand the world and the context that they live in. And this is what sociologists study about obesity. We're interested in why people become obese, who are they, what do they do when they become obese, and how can public health interventions help people maintain a healthy body weight. As sociologists, we don't look at inside people's bodies and look at the physiology, but we look at people and the societies that they live in and how they develop, and what sort of changes in people's contexts and lives which produce obesity. That's what we're interested in. What sociologists look at is the overall changes in our daily life, and important factors there are that we don't work so much hard, physical labor has decreased. We find food everywhere in our daily lives, so we are tempted all the time by an abundance of cheap foodstuffs. And the way we eat, our eating patterns have changed. We eat perhaps more on an individual basis. We have frequent meals, we can snack. The cultural rules which have governed our eating before is now changing. So we look at a variety of social and cultural factors and economic factors which influence how we eat and how we move around in the world. As sociologists, we contribute to intervention research by looking at what makes interventions work and what makes them not work when that happens. We look at how people adapt to different kinds of policies, and we look at unintended side effects, because some interventions may work very well, but there may also be things happening that was not anticipated. People may develop depression or uncertainty or self-hatred, or their social relations may be hampered by the interventions, and things like that are very important if we want to help people not become obese. It must work in their lives. The way sociologists work with evidence depends on the methodology we use. Much sociology is based on qualitative research, and there the argumentation and the presentation of interpretations are part of how we judge the validity of studies. And some sociologists make large quantitative surveys, for instance, on which basis they can make statistical generalization. And this is a different kind of evidence, more similar perhaps to some of the interventions or the great population studies from natural science. Obesity is a multiple phenomenon. It is both social, cultural, psychological, but it's also certainly a physiological matter. And it is a limitation of sociology that we're not competent to study the physiological processes. But our contribution is to make sure that we don't see obesity as an isolated physiological phenomenon, but that we realize that obesity happens in real life, among real people, in real societies. That's our contribution. I think it's urgently important with more interdisciplinary collaboration in obesity research, because we have underdeveloped our understanding of how the physiological processes that leads to obesity, how they are linked to how societies develop, how life develops, what cultures and subgroups we live in. And we need to understand this complexity if we're ever to be able to address it in an adequate manner.
What were your thoughts regarding obesity prior to seeing this video? Was it that obesity is caused by the fact that people eat too much and the solution is they should just pull themselves together and eat less? In that case, I hope this video has given you food for thought. However, our main aim with this video has not been to teach you something about obesity. It has been to tell you something about the nature of science. As you have heard in the interviews, scientists from a range of scientific disciplines approach the issue of obesity in very different ways. They differ in the methods they use to approach the issue. They differ in the assumptions they make about the nature of the underlying problem. However, they all seem to agree that none of them have the full answer to the questions that can be asked about obesity. And that's because obesity is what you call a multifactorial problem. So different factors explain why people become obese. and to solve the problem, a combination of a number of very different interventions may be required. I suggest that you now spend some time thinking about the following 5 questions. The first question is, how do the methods used to study obesity differ? The second question is, which assumptions underlie the 6 different approaches to the study of obesity that you have seen here? The third question is, to what extent do the different approaches supplement each other, and to what extent are they in conflict? The fourth question is, can you think of ways of improving the collaboration between disciplines to deal with the issue of obesity? The fifth question is, can you think of other issues that, like obesity, call for the collaboration between different scientific disciplines to find good solutions?